I've got the slides open. I'm on the title slide. Just say next slide.
All right, every time I click my thing, I'm going to tell you the next slide. Okay.
All right.
Click. All right, so we have a subtitle that's about keeping the bioethical science horse ahead of the stakeholders' anecdotal cart. Obviously, that's a bit of an issue because I do come from a different world from where you folks are. And Florida may be seemingly a little backwards that way, but we're working our way through this. So as we click to one more slide, I wanted to give you a basic outline for what I'd like to cover with you tonight. Obviously, we have some very different politics where you are or we are here. But also the plant itself is sort of a roadblock because in that it's very different than it was in a generation ago, even when I was a kid here. Translational research is something I didn't know about myself until fairly recently. And if I can't see you guys out there, if I go to have a show of hands, to make sure everybody knows what translational science is. Basically, you can think of it as the safest, most efficient way to bring a new discovery from what they call the lab bench to the bedside. Do know the hard controversy still festers in most parts of the country, and I'd like to approach a discussion as we move along a bit today about talking about what bioethics are as compared to medical legal ethics, and then most importantly, the future for healthcare. I say reading the cannabis leaves, but obviously a science in its infancy has great potential. Where it moves and how it gets there is something I'll take you through where I see this going over the next few years. Click, go ahead, George. All right, so basically, I'm a plant, and so this is a picture of one of my greenhouses where I grow some of the world's most rare and horticulturally challenged tropical ornamentals. I've been nurturing plants for nearly all of my adult life. I attended every university majoring in chemistry and a minor in psychology before going on to medical school at the University of Miami. I'm a boarded anesthesiologist, and my fellowship was in pain management and addiction medicine. So I sort of cover how cannabis has come to life. In fact, when I was in high school, a chemistry professor in our high school, who was a hippie in those days, actually wrote Mishulam's first description of the molecular structure of THC on blackboard, and that's back in 1972. So I followed it for a while. I'm actually also a Florida Department of Agriculture Master Gardener course educator, and I'm a reasonably good horticulturist. But of course, I don't grow plants illegal in Miami, but when I'm in Colorado, I can take part in having some beautiful plants. Click there, George. What are you looking at now?
Black gorilla.
All right, black gorilla, and then click one more time. This is goldenberry. The reason I have these pictures from plants that I had been around with growing is to point out, if you can see on your slide, I have no idea how large your screen is, in the top right is a close-up showing the trichomes. It's not an electron microscopy. Those are the little tees and golf balls you can see where all the special chemistry happens. I appreciated how the delta-9 THC of cultivars existed, but not with these things. I'm familiar with Acapulco Gold or Maui Wowie, and these had about a 5% dry weight of THC plus an array of other phytocannabinoids and terpenes. And those were always popular when I was a young guy, but these have been pushed under federal prohibition to be much, much more potent cultivars. Of course, several of the western states growers have hybridized cannabis with a particular genetically dominant Afghani Kush cultivar. They would expectedly produce and feature the single constituent cannabis that's sought for its psychotropic effects, and this exceeds 25% dry weight of a single secondary metabolite constituent, THC. This is actually a most amazing feat of selective hybridization, and now I'm speaking to you as a plantsman. So unfortunately, though, the plant today is largely the most balanced constituents, and as a result, I regard it as being considerably less imaginative for therapeutic healthcare innovations. Go ahead and click, George. So the connection and similarity between plant and animal chemistries is actually quite fascinating. Even at a molecular level, human hemoglobin and the plant source of energy molecule, chlorophyll, are remarkably alike. Not only are they alike, but with the single exception of the central 2+ charged cation, these two critical molecules that sustain plant and animal life respectively have essentially identical molecular structures. And a farmer who's in a sense a plant doctor therapeutically uses magnesium in chlorophyll very much the same way that a physician uses iron to sustain hemoglobin molecules strategic function. So when seen here side by side, you can really appreciate how flora and fauna chemistry captured my scientific interest, and these discoveries are not new. These date back well over 40 years. So here's a modern thought on just this point. If you go to, as a patient, to your own doc's office, and while in the waiting room you see an unhealthy or a dying plant, how do you feel about the doctor as your healer? Okay? Click again. All right, so the states most likely to legalize medical and adult use cannabis in 2016 are quickly reviewed here. Obviously, Florida has a blue line around it, if you can see it. We have been a CBD-only state, but we're having a second constitutional amendment to try to expand that. I first approached the Florida Medical Association back about 3 years ago and was appointed as their designated expert on botanical medicines. I authored the mandated 8-hour physician course that's required of any Florida physician seeking to authorize patients to receive cannabis, and then it was published by the Florida Department of Health that year. So when the rules changed in Florida's only existing law concerning medical cannabis, they were successfully judicially challenged and rules were changed. The Florida Surgeon General then asked me to be the only physician that actually rewrote those rules. So Florida politics continues to evolve on the issue of cannabis for compassionate care, and this November we'll have yet another constitutional amendment. Organized medicine continues to participate in the debates on this because it involves legislation that attempts to define what concentrations of cannabis chemicals can be used and for which diseases. The last time I looked, that was considered as the practice of medicine, and so doctors are understandably concerned when politicians and stakeholders legislate their licensed practice of medicine. So the patient in this next image, go ahead and move it along. This could be my mom, okay? And this was what was coming about with the last constitutional amendment. I'm a member of the Florida Medical Association, so the label on his lapel there sort of pissed me off. He looks quite bored and obviously most uneducated with his prescribing a knee-jerk response of an opiate. So the image of the doctor here appearing as uncompassionate in that context really disturbed me and wanted to get me involved. Next slide, please. So responsibly shared scientific knowledge concerning cannabis also coincided with federal prohibition. And when the government's only source of education about botanical medicines, called the United States Pharmacopoeia, ceased to be provided in 1942, that was really the most standing point. But obviously there was a big media blitz, and just for 2 minutes, the highlights of Reefer Madness is always entertaining to start a presentation. So click it again, George, and play it on.
The burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or glass case. You will meet Bill, for one so broad in his strong will, as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
All right, so that's always fun to look at. We're much more educated now. But the key here is that barely 5 years after the Marijuana Tax Act, in 1942, when the U.S. Pharmacopoeia ceased to be published, I want you to know that the American Medical Association at that time said, don't do this. This is the only source of education on the plant. And yet, of course, it stopped being published. And so physicians have sort of been kept in the dark ever since. And I'll tell you what happens is 2 generations later, My toughest audience are not the medical students I encounter at the University of Miami, nor who I found out in Colorado, but they're the senior docs, ones who have been trained all their lives that it has no medical use and high potential for abuse. It's harder to unlearn something than to learn it right the first time. Next slide. So progressing right up to where we are today with a lot of national momentum, this is a slide that came out of the RQ New Frontier Collaborative Marketing Research Report published in March. You can see there's 2 arrows pointing to maroon-colored circles there. They both have to deal with research, and I don't know if you can read them on the slides, but for the most part, what I want to point out in the lower left legend is that color is considered as negative. I'll tell you that I don't necessarily consider those as negatives either. They may be negatives to the stakeholders, people interested in the recreational market, but the research that's required from both of these are likely to happen as a result of either of those. To me, is a positive, because we're still lacking in that respect, and this chart, in fact, reveals if those are the only weaknesses and negatives. We've come a long way, and things are getting very exciting now. Next slide. So let's move right into cannabis when it was used as a botanical medicine. The plant's been fascinating to study, in that it has recently identified a most essential receptor system with a mechanism of action that is beginning to reveal an extraordinarily wide range of therapeutic potential. The modern era has ushered in a supporting science to explain many biochemical questions related to human healthcare. Next slide. We have certain assumptions concerning the profitability of an adult use recreational market. But again, the research that's being demanded federally, these are all predicated on the a priori experiences of medical use applications that will require data acquisition to answer the important therapeutic questions regarding cannabis' safety and efficacy. Next slide. So in academic institutions, there exists a wonderful opportunity where you are, where I am, to officially initiate endocannabinoid science, research, and development in the advance of what appears destined to be the inevitable repeal of cannabis prohibition by its rescheduling, even if only to Schedule II, as a controlled substance. In the meantime, education, we're doing it tonight, is critically needed to enable today's students to understand and contribute to the development of this most fascinating new science's future for novel therapeutic applications. So at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, you can advance the slide there, we're advancing and innovating a new program endeavor to be known as the ESIRD Institute, E-S-I-R-D, ESIRD being an acronym for Endocannabinoid Science, Interdisciplinary Research and Development. Next slide, or press. So the issue surrounding this new science discovery goes to the very heart and soul of why academic institutions are and what they're supposed to provide. They're supposed to be a home to bring educators and research from near and far, just like tonight, to discuss the evidence-based supporting science and promote further thought, all in the name of advancing better healthcare. Next slide. At the National Institutes of Health, Drs. Patcher and Kuhn, two particularly well-respected and government-funded MD, PhD physician researchers. And they reviewed a recently discovered human receptor system, of course, known as the endocannabinoid system. This paper I cited came out 3 years ago. I advise you to look at it. It's a framework for what's happening today. After a thorough review of supporting science, they published their findings and made this very remarkable statement I've highlighted here, that modulating the activity of the endocannabinoid system holds therapeutic promise for a broad range of diseases. Endocannabinoid system, ECS activity, may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. This is not me saying this. These are top government researchers 3 years ago. I've never seen any statement such as that come out of the government that had such profound implications. Next slide. Translational research, then, is the method. That's how this is happening. It implements a bench-to-bedside accelerated approach, emphasizing safety and efficacy. From laboratory experiments through clinical trials to point-of-care patient applications, harnessing knowledge from the basic sciences to produce new drugs, new devices, and new treatment options for patients. As a relatively recent research discipline, translational research incorporates aspects of both basic science and clinical research It requires skills and resources that are not readily available in a basic lab or clinical setting. For these reasons, translational research is more effective in dedicated university research science departments. So universities with dedicated schools of public health in particular be well suited to balance risks of subjects such as cannabis. Now that the receptor system understanding of the endocannabinoids are within us have been identified, it becomes much easier to understand how the concept of relieving stresses, both physical and psychological, is an essential species survival trait. The anxiety associated with psychological stress is well known to affect our perception of physical pain, and we all exhibit different tolerances to how we respond to pain. The endocannabinoid system then helps to mitigate these natural life stresses, both psychologically and physically. The secret to choosing appropriate research projects needs for cannabis to rest on how we maintain focus on the endocannabinoid system itself, not simply on the phytocannabinoid system within cannabis. A subliminal allure from marijuana is all too often skewing and distracting our attention away from scientific viewpoints intended to benefit our patients to that of focusing on the plant itself. And as a clinical physician interested in meaningful future research involving the endocannabinoid sciences, I like the analogy of a researcher to an archer. And then we'll be showing a slide on that in a little while with bullseyes. The investigational research archer has to focus purely on the target, and remember that the target is the endocannabinoid system. We have this within us not because there's a plant there, but there is a plant that magically interacts with this system that has revealed this receptor system much in the same way that narcotics and opium from a poppy reveal the endorphin system. Next slide. So as of last year, an overwhelming amount of supportive science has forced us to take another look at medical marijuana. You got a picture there of CNN?
Yep.
Okay, good. Move through the next slide a minute. Its exposure within the media has encouraged our citizen patients to ask intelligent questions of their physician healers. And finally, the next slide after that's coming up, in terms of a new emerging science, such as the endocannabinoid medicine, goes to the very heart and soul of, like I said, what we expect from our academic institutions. What I'm showing you here is very important in that we now have the National Institutes of Health offering their sciences collectively what is called open access. If any of you haven't had a chance to review online the collective summit held on March 22nd and 23rd, you might want to look at it, because it involved, in fact, not simply NIDA and not simply the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, but also include the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, the National Institute on Mental Health, and the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. So those 5 elements of the National Institutes of Health, and there are many more, all participated in a collective open access Seeking the Real Science seminar for those 2 days. I encourage you to look this up online. Some of the researchers there are very smart people, and they may know a lot about lab rats and petri dishes. You guys deal with human patients. I've been spending my whole career as a clinical anesthesiologist. I deal with patients. Between you and I, as soon as I give a rat test what it does to a rat, I'll let you know. But in the meantime, this evidence is being accumulated to reveal things about the endocannabinoid system we really don't know. And that's important because, like I said, we have the system not only within us, but within all vertebrates and even invertebrates. It's that essential and primitive of a system. Next slide. Cannabis plant actually traced back 36 million years. And its evidence has been found supported by human beings in Asia since the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, when areas known as refugia, a few of them are here, the red little area in the middle of Asia there was one. These are areas where it stayed warm enough to allow certain plant and animal species to survive. And these maps come from an extensive and scholarly work by Robert Clark and Mark Merlin entitled Cannabis, Evolution and Ethnobotany from 2013. Well, prehistoric healers would have had to have been among the finest horticulturists in the ancient times, whether in the earliest of primitive nomadic tribes or in advancing agricultural civilizations that followed. If the healer, equivalent to today's physician, couldn't keep plants alive, they would have failed at their craft by losing their formulary. And then they wouldn't have been regarded as neither a good healer or plantsman. So even today's contemporary healers' knowledge of flora and fauna's life forces, like the slide I showed you before, between chlorophyll and hemoglobin, provide a very special understanding of how to nurture nature. Click to advance the slide there, George. Unlike today's man-made, highly concentrated THC cultivars of marijuana that have been transformed under prohibition, there's genetic evidence that the ancestrally balanced chemical constituents found in traditional cannabis strains successfully co-evolved with humans and found their way around the world with us. It would seem to make ethnobotanical sense that if it was used by human beings for over 10,000 years, traditional cannabis likely interplayed favorably with our genes to meet our physiology's survival needs. Unlike most other plants that use several methods to distribute their presence, such as wind, insect pollination, and seed dispersal by animals, this plant spread over geographical distribution has done with human agriculture as being the vector credited for having transported cannabis all around the world. Next slide, or next progress there. So ancient civilizations understood and shared the importance of plants to sustaining health, and there's how it came over to the New World. You may also catch some letters there of NLD, BLD, BLH. These are different varietals of cannabis and strains that went to be hemp, with the H or D as drug strains, narrow-leaf or broad-leaf varieties. And these have been pretty well delineated for where they went to and how they were used by human beings, either as a textile or as a drug medicine. Next slide. Civilization's earliest physician healers, such as Imhotep in Egypt and later Hippocrates, they clearly appreciated nature's bounty. Here, ancient wisdom healers' compassionate botanical wisdom is shared for generational health. Next slide. Here we have the slide that might show Imhotep in ancient Egypt, and if you click the slide one more time, you'll see Hippocrates, largely regarded as the father of modern medicine. Imhotep and Hippocrates reported their findings and thus began medicine as a true evidence-based science. So it had been known for thousands of years that plants had healing and curative properties to restore the balances needed to sustain life. What was still unknown, were the chemical compounds responsible. Next slide. All right, you show a slide with Sir Robert Robertson now, correct?
Correct.
Good. This all changed in 1947. This is when post-World War II science finally found one of the plant world's most powerful weapons against human disease, alkaloids. That year, Nobel Prize in Chemistry to Sir Robert Robertson, and his citation speech included the following passage. They usually have striking, sometimes sensational physiologic effects. Among them are quinine, cocaine, and atropine, all of which have important medicinal qualities. Plants containing alkaloids have generally drawn the attention of primitive peoples, and in cases where they are met in countries with ancient culture, their knowledge of their properties often goes back to prehistoric age. Sir Robert Robertson, pictured here, most of his chemical work was deciphering the chemistry leading to the synthesis of cocaine. So Nobel Prizes, whether with controversial plants, cocaine, of course, in those days and age being an anesthetic, also having vasoconstrictive properties. This was his contribution, and of course the way you see in Bolivia, the way native people have cocaine, it's very different than what you see in the typical Miami pictures of Al Pacino with Scarface imagery. Next slide. So in addition to cocaine, plant alkaloids also include not only botanical medicines such as morphine, atropine, ephedrine, curare, quinine, aspirin, but also other habit-forming substances common to everyday life, such as nicotine, caffeine, and even chocolate. Tell me about those things being addicting. Next slide. So thousands of years ago, China and India evolved approaches to human health that apply to traditional Eastern understanding of how people should integrate with their environment, including with plants. Next slide. This is where traditional Eastern medicine meets Western medicine. What I want you to see here, this is kind of a cool slide. Acupuncture chart, ancient on the left. If you look at the number of acupuncture points and where Eastern healers regard life flow to be through, it's actually through the apple. not through the brain, not through the extremities. If you look to the right, brighter colors, the green, reds, and orange, those are all signifying the presence of CB2 receptor distribution. CB2 receptors, in terms of how they protect and respond and show up where you would expect in response to chronic diseases, seems to be very exciting of where the future of endocannabinoid science will go. So in fact, perhaps it's the ancients who understood the brain-gut connection, and that, as far as I'm concerned, is fairly well evidenced here to have its channels through the endocannabinoid system. Next slide. So balance risk side effects from plant-based chemicals that exert their effects on receptor systems are well known to anesthesiologists. We deal with balance risk reduction by manipulating agonists and antagonists every day. A key difference between these two plant-derived receptor plant chemicals lies in the brainstem, contains endorphin receptors that would influence the poppy, simultaneously affect the brain's ability and signal the drive to breathe. So overdosing that can be heralded by not breathing, bringing quick death. In contrast, of course, cannabis exerts its effects on endocannabinoid receptors elsewhere throughout the body and the brain, but remarkably are not found in the brainstem. So lethal respiratory consequences from cannabis overdosing is, of course, not a consequence of any lethal results. Nevertheless, driving off the road haplessly is a known potentially lethal consequence of cannabis effects through CB1 receptors found elsewhere in the brain. There are actually some fascinating driving studies that happened last year through the University of Iowa through a huge simulator. I'll show you a slide of in just a moment. And driving is a very complex function of the brain. Speed determination, responses to coordination, as well as tracking require different parts of the brain that are affected differentially by THC. And I'll show you a little more about that in just a moment. So with a new wealth of evidence-based science emerging worldwide, the media has placed much attention on the new evolving field of endocannabinoid medicine. Next slide. Remember that CB1 and CB2 receptors, and if you look at the two little green dots in the left-hand corner, they act as a master control of other receptors functioning. And in comparison to when I was in medical school, we had just a small sampling of known other receptors. Today we have many, many more better understood receptor systems that interplay and have modulation potential through the CB receptors. Next slide. Heroin. This was an analog of morphine marketed by Bayer. See, we talked about its side effects and the fact that it does work on a different receptor system. But Bayer was actually first marketing this as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, and it quite obviously proved otherwise. Of note that as it was built today, its lipid solubility would make it particularly safe and effective for spinal anesthetics. Next slide. There's a recently published revised CDC controlled guidelines for prescribing opiates for chronic pain. And they address very significant healthcare issues in which anesthesiologists would be expected to provide leadership roles in new initiatives. Cannabis therapy in certain cases of chronic pain may, of course, allow for balanced risk reduction strategies to produce safer patient outcomes. Next slide. I want to advance here, and I said in the outline originally we'd like to talk a little bit about ethics, because you're in a place which is fairly progressive and it doesn't necessarily have the same momentum elsewhere in the country. So we look for doing right versus wrong, and we are addressing ethics as it exists. Well, there are several kinds of ethics, and I wanted to share with you, I don't know if anybody in the audience is a member of the American Medical Association, but as the largest single group representing doctors nationally, the government looks at this statement where it says that a physician shall respect the law and also recognize the responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Well, that sounds nice, but it's entirely ineffectual. And the reason that it is that physicians, of course, don't only have the state license, they have a federal license. And that federal or DEA license is, in essence, their tool bag. And most mainstream physicians are reluctant to get into authorizing cannabis to patients, even in states where it's legal, in fear of jeopardizing losing their tool bag. It has happened, there's precedent for it, and in most physicians' minds at this moment, it's too big of a risk being a Schedule I substance. So bioethics then is a different approach to reflecting and dealing with new discoveries within the natural sciences. And this is an important difference. It actually reduces to an ethical right for individuals to determine and defend their core survival instinct. So bioethics, in contrast, is an activity. It's not just a statement here and now, forever will stay that way. It's a shared, reflective examination of ethical values in healthcare, health science, and health policy. And of course, these fields have always had ethical standards handed down in each profession, and often without question. But about 50 years ago, when the acceleration of post-war science discoveries revealed situations previously not considered, it became obvious that a more public and critical discussion of these standards would be needed. So bioethics is that discussion. And it takes place in the media, academic classroom, labs, and hospitals, not only by doctors within organized medicine, but with their patients, and not only with scientists and politicians, but with the general public. The dilemma exists of a biochemical consequence of new discoveries that I believe is better approached by preparing a bioethical position statement. We'll advance to one here next. Let's advance to the next slide. I think you should see a physician holding a patient's hand.
Yep.
Good. The issue when you make a ethical statement is usually based around a circumstance or a statement. And obviously the question is, how does one render compassionate care while under federal prohibition? And this is where a bioethical statement can come up, which either takes a compromising in a Jeffersonian sort of way to try to find common ground that both sides can compromise on, or what I think is a better approach for bioethics is to make an irrefutable statement that neither can deny. So what I'd like to propose here in a moment are two sentences, one applying to an ethical position of fact as I see it through the perspective of the patient, and the other through the perspective of the healer. So please click again for me. And so this will be a bioethical perspective. And it may take sometimes reading it once or twice. And again, I invite anybody in the audience to contact me. This is a work in progress. But seeking relief from the physical, psychological, or spiritual, any of those symptoms are stressful of disease and instinctual force of human nature and contributes to medicinal use. The treatment of the intolerable symptoms is an honorable task that society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. The reason I wanted to call especially that second statement to you as healers is I just mentioned a moment ago the dilemma of having two licenses, a state license versus a federal license, sometimes as a confounder for mainstream docs. Well, the other confounder for mainstream docs in many states which have legalized medical cannabis is that the states that are doing this are doing so by designating which strengths or which chemicals can be used for what diseases. And as I mentioned earlier, the last time I checked on what that was, it was generally called the practice of medicine, and mainstream physicians are, in my opinion, understandably adverse to being legislated the practice of their craft. So legal access to cannabis in 24 states has advanced through this politically and legislatively effective mantra of compassion. And when I was entering private practice in the early and later 1980s, patients with AIDS were typically dying from either pneumocystis carotis pneumonia or from wasting syndromes, and they commonly referred to that as thin man disease. Well, that was the first generally accepted use of cannabis for compassionate care, and it happened when these afflicted patients accessed the course grounds laced with cannabis that I think Don Abrams told you about a few weeks ago. And this significantly reduced their nausea and vomiting associated with AIDS, and the early oral medications were used to treat the illness. But a few years ago, of course, the second and particularly effective compassionate care outcry was extended through the parents of the children affected with the rare form of unrelenting epilepsy. And when no other medications helped, that cannabis, of course, appeared to evidence relief. It was popularized, of course, by Sanjay Gupta in Weeds 2. Weeds 3, on the other hand, most recently presented the third program on compassionate care. And that, of course, looks at compassionate care rendered to veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. The biggest difference there is those patients seek to vote, while the little children may not. But the children, of course, have generated an extraordinary pathos throughout the country as a result. So medical, legal, ethical considerations, again, surrounding cannabis have yet to provide effective advances in its application for healthcare for cannabis, while responsibly and constructively advancing these new discoveries, particularly involving controversial issues, often begin and get shared through a bioethical process. The same thing happened with stem cells about a decade ago. If you remember, that went through a bioethical process. Next slide. So I've got a few comments to share now, getting into the plan regarding federal prohibition that went into effect in '37. Prohibition presented circumstances that have resulted in very significant changes to that prohibited cannabis plant. Compared to just a century ago, the contemporary cannabis plant has radically changed in its size and chemical content, not necessarily for the better. By the 1970s, the revised laws in Holland and Amsterdam to develop legal recreational cannabis gathered seeds in banks that had varietal strains coming from Thailand and Afghanistan. By the 1980s, these same seed sources and hybridizing technology was shared, especially in California, that transformed the native and natural balance of phytocannabinoids and their terpenes. So cannabis, as a balanced botanical synergy of these phytocannabinoids and terpenes, had therapeutically co-evolved with humans over thousands of years, suddenly became a smaller, squattier, stronger plant due to the direction of prohibition. Cannabis plants like these grow into normally 20 to 25-foot plants. They're difficult to hide, grown outdoors, seen by a helicopter, and it's not a good idea if you're getting caught with a plant like that because it's a felony offense. So click the slide here for me, George, because over the past quarter century, considered hybridizing, are you at the smaller plants now?
Yes.
Okay, has grown up with a particular plant known as Afghani number 1, and has now dramatically altered the plant size and its constituent chemicals. Afghani number 1 strains were favored for hybridizing because it was a small plant, flowers quickly and robustly, and the flowers featured lots of THC and a particularly sedating essential oil terpene called myrcene. That's the dominant strain. Myrcene is known to be synergistic with THC. It's not only notably sedating, but I'll tell you as an anesthesiologist, myrcene has a particular quality of also being hypnotic. And that in of itself, in my opinion, is one of the major contributions or problems with the plant being now much more of a stoner high. The hypnotic tendency of it, which is typical of myrcene. So hybrids using Afghani number 1s soon became the important darling of an emerging clandestine indoor growing industry, particularly in California. And like I said, I emphasized unfortunate because the cannabis of today is really a medically bastardized result of human efforts under prohibition. It was actually the remarkable engineering of this to have the plants have as much dry weight THC is a pretty cool thing from horticulturists, but not so much in terms of a therapeutic healer. So at this time, the cannabis plant as a botanical medicine seems a little boring to me, and I'd much rather see reverse engineering to hybridize the plant. And we'll be talking about not just simply that through hybridizing, but we'll be talking about the genetics that are being revealed to try to bring back some of those older strains. Consider the possibility then that in the 24 states that currently have some form of legalization for medical cannabis, approximately 80% of all the physician authorizations are for the single diagnosis of pain. So the precursor phytocannabinoid molecule for THC is called cannabidiol, or CBG, and it's shown great potential for use in neuropathic pain. When coupled with the sedating myrcene, this phytocannabinoid terpene combination would be helpful in treating pain in patients needing more rest or convalescing. However, if that same patient on Monday morning and it's time to go back to work, that's not your medicine because of the myrcene. So in essence then, so for a patient needing a medicine that could be used during the workday, combined the analgesic effects with CBG and say pinene, would produce a pain medicine perhaps better used for responsible daytime activity. These varieties of synergistic chemicals used to exist in true landrace cannabis sativa strains of long ago, but today they're like dodo birds. They truly are extinct due to the dominant genes in this Afghani Kush. Next slide. Addiction and responsible dosing, that is an issue of great social and health concerns in society. Click it again for me, Richard. I had to try to come up with a saying concerning the dosing of modern strains of cannabis. If there's one thing I'd like you to take from this evening's talk, is we still know incredibly little about dosing, and also incredibly little about the long-term effects of downregulating this particular receptor system. So concerning dosing, again, I have to find one little sort of palindrome if that's what it is. If you can't control your dose can control you. And that seems pretty obvious, but if you click the slide one more time, we sort of make a parody of it because of the fact that it doesn't necessarily stop you from breathing. It's comical, but again, with the driving there, this does become perhaps not the message we want to try to share. As far as driving, though, under it, if you can advance to the next slide. Well, we got a little thing about the president on the next slide first. Click it and click it a second time just for a little blurb from Obama to Sanjay Gupta.
To the President of the United States, there's a bill on the floor of the Senate now proposing that marijuana get rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, saying it has no medicinal benefit to possible medicinal benefit. Do you support that?
You know, I think I'd have to take a look at the details, but I'm on record as saying that not only do I think carefully prescribed medical use of marijuana may in fact be appropriate, and we should follow the science as opposed to ideology on this issue.
Okay, click one more time for me. All right, this is actually the NAPS driving simulator at the University of Iowa. It's been used for alcohol types of assessments for driving impairment for years. And it's cool. It's about the size of an airplane hangar. If anybody's ever been to like Universal or any of these theme parks where you go inside these big devices, it can make things seem very real. And so they've done extensive testing on people exposed to alcohol, cannabis, and the combination of the two. And the two substances have very different effects on driving. Patients who have the effects of alcohol have a harder time determining speed. They also don't tend to recognize impairment. Sure, get drunk, I'll take the keys and go on driving, while patients, presumably, who have certain levels of what may otherwise be determined later to be impairment with cannabis, generally know they've got the buzz and think, well, maybe it's not a good time for me to drive. You generally can tell people who are driving under one substance or the other. The cannabis driver drives sometimes prohibitively slow. And the main problem with driving under cannabis is found to be the ability to stay within the lane. And you see it on the road sometimes and you know it. When you put two together, alcohol and cannabis, of course, the two are compounded. So these are findings that are pretty well being determined now. There is some work being done on saliva to try to assess levels of THC as it may be reflected in blood. Still, the exact correlation with impairment is yet to be determined, but the government right now is very seriously looking into this for a comparable roadside, either sobriety test or some way that certain products can be measured. The most impressive studies that have come out of the world happened from Australia. And in Australia, they looked at 4,000 fatal accidents, most of which did not simply involve cannabis, but cannabis and alcohol. But there were enough studies to divide out and just sector out only cannabis users, which was the exception. And they were trying to come up with a dose level that would correspond to what alcohol prohibited driving levels might be as a starting point to see when is somebody likely to be impaired. Stay tuned on that. It's going to happen whether you like it or not, because that seems to be where the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the government is going with simulators such as this. Next slide. So 50 years ago, Pablo Meshulam from Hebrew University in Israel identified these chemical structures of THC. What I did here briefly is I highlighted in blue those principal chemical out of both the THC and CBD. There'll be a short test on this later. But obviously you can see on the bottom left that you have different ways of acid synthase, degradation, and decarboxylation. The neat part is, even in their acid forms, these cannabinoids have their own chemistry, and they are sometimes notably different than what you would see in ignited, smoked, or vaporized product in how THC affects people. So there are many, many compound chemicals involved, and that's one of the problems that the government has had in terms of researching. Remember, the basic idea of how one patent one disease, one treatment goes through one profit margin, has been not on looking at compounds of chemicals, of mixtures, but in looking at individual molecules. The government now, though, because of the way different chemicals for that cancer shot we hear about collectively are working from different perspectives to complement the immune system, in fact, is something now that the FDA is looking much more actively at how do compounds of chemicals work. That'll be very important because so far the results of just single chemical derivatives from cannabis, such as marinol, are very limiting, and it's likely because they don't represent the naturally evolved chemical balance that exists in the plant's chemistry itself. Next slide. So 25 years after the discovery of THC, it took 25 years, Meshulam's research team in Israel went on to reveal a much more significant discovery. Now we're really going to get into the science of this and the receptors. They identified a naturally occurring molecule working within us, obviously, that mimic the way that THC works. THC doesn't mimic the way anandamide or 2-AG do, the two endogenous cannabinoids. It's the other way around. So it interacts with a lipid-based signaling system, and it's a vast system in our body. It's a system of chemical reactions to control an enormous amount of physiologic function, and it's obviously referred to as our endocannabinoid receptor system. It was soon found with 2-AG after anandamide, and these molecules are naturally manufactured on demand in all of us, and they interact by regulating two distinct sets of endocannabinoid receptors. I'm sure you know both CB1 and CB2. It's not quite that simple cut because this heralded a brand new field of medicine, and what's most remarkable is that the plant contains molecules that mimic our own body's chemicals. So what's fascinating about this system is that it is ubiquitous. It's responsible for regulating how our memories work, how our emotions work, how our digestion and insulin works, how our muscle tone works, how cell-to-cell recognition, which is the basis of cancers, work, and inflammation. And yet, if you look into most medical or pharmacy textbooks of more than, say, 10 years old, you probably won't find anything about the endocannabinoid system. And so this is really quite remarkable for a regulatory system that's fundamentally responsible for essential holistic aspects determining those physiologic functions that allow us to adjust to natural stressors as successfully evolving creatures, ranging from our immune system responses to our very personalities. Next slide. So as human beings, we've evolved by successfully dealing with balancing life challenges, not only painful experiences, but also ones of pleasure. And these experiences over time will come to define our individual tolerances and in fact determine our personalities. CB1 receptors, pictured here, seem to be involved with our emotional memory, and it's located in the limbic system of our brains. If you think about it, if women in particular could not help themselves from maintaining vivid memories of childbirth, one of life's most painful experiences, we would likely be all only children, and our mothers would have only one child. So imagine if our language had no need for the word brother or sister. This is where it all happens in our brains. So let's think for just a moment about where we might have evolved to develop a healthy to forget, not only forgetting painful experiences like childbirth, but pleasurable ones as well. Because pain and pleasure are essentially interconnected within our brains in a most classic philosophical way. Spinoza, Descartes, they all envisioned that there was actually some sort of a continuum connecting those. And I'm not talking about masochism or those kind of things. I'm just saying the way we're wired has a good reason for being able to forget not only the extremes of pain, but what about the extremes of pleasure? Next slide. So not recalling where you may have left your car keys may not seem anything more than a nuisance, but forgetting may be essential to how we deal with many of life's complex issues that have direct application to our mental health and behavior. It's critically important not to forget that we have an ability to forget, that it's evolved in us for a reason that has nothing to do with the plant's chemicals. Successful extinguishing of certain memories is essential for our own healthy environment. So imagine these case scenarios in prehistoric people if you want to simply survive, see another day. unhealthy pain avoidance or unhealthy pleasure seeking each have a basis in the endocannabinoid system's influence on the brain, the hippocampus particularly, where memories are successfully filtered by forgetting. You know, I'd like to just break off to a quick story a second about primitive people. So let's imagine that people in the room there were all part of a nomadic tribe of prehistoric cave people, literally cave people. And let's say that we are on our way foraging, just trying to find a fish or a squirrel to survive that day. And out of nowhere comes a wild beast. Let's say a wild hog, and it starts chasing us. But imagine something prehistoric like the size of a Buick. It's really scary. And now imagine that we run and run, we're out of breath, we're maybe bleeding, we scamper up a tree. And we're waiting there. Now that it's not going to stick around at night because something will come and eat it. So we better have a way to recover while we're up in that tree, because come dawn, not eternal now, we got to get out of that tree. So we have to be able to acutely in this situation forget the sheer panic, stress, and pain of that traumatic event. The PTSD that you hear of that can't be forgotten is not a normal, healthy, evolved way to forget to see another day. Because if we don't rest that night and recover both physically and mentally, we're not out of that tree that next day, and each day we get weaker and weaker until we fall out and become pig food. So in that primitive example, I just want you to understand it's got nothing with the plant. It's the way it's wired. So I want to change dynamics a second to point to how I brought up a moment ago, and you can advance to the next slide. It's not only about pain. It's very important for a healthy individual to be wired naturally in such a way that they don't necessarily remember extremes of pleasure. I like this intersection here. There really must be a sign like that. So I like this slide. But let's take the same primitive example of cave people and think of the way that primitive people found pleasure. What releases dopamine better than sex, okay? So how about a group of primitive people foraging on for the day, and in the back, always lagging behind, there's Caveman Og and his girlfriend, Lady Pleistocene. And let's pretend the two of them can't keep their hands off each other. They're addicted to sex. They like it so much. Both groups are lagging behind. Everybody else in the group saying, come on, guys, let's keep up with us, or go find a cave somewhere. But they're constantly conflicted. So if you were a saber-toothed tiger stalking, who would you pick off first? Okay, the one's not paying attention. The one's seeking the pleasure. So there probably are reasons that that kind of behavior is not necessarily inherently mainstream. It's not consistent with evolutionary survival if it's taken to that extent. So we probably all live within some balance of avoiding extremes. And the key word here is balance. Nature always strives to get a balance. And I think that that can be a good sort of formative model between seeking a balance, not extending the extreme of either pleasure seeking or pain avoidance. Next slide. So CB2 receptors that are involved in what's called inflammation in tissue, they seem to play a pivotal role in the brain-gut connection that's often described as essential to our health by homeopathic physicians and by traditional Chinese medicine advocates of acupuncture. This is precisely where in the body we tend to find the greatest majority of CB2 receptors in the gut. Next slide. In fact, by explaining the endocannabinoid system's mechanisms of action and its clinical roles, that they're most easily described from a lifelines point of view and anatomic reference. So I'd like you to try to pay close attention to this next slide. Don't do advance. Go ahead and advance one more. Where are you up to right now, George?
CB1, CB2.
Good. Okay. Remember where these are found: brain versus gut, because their existence and how they work from birth through death could be a good working clinical model to see how intertwined the endocannabinoid system is not only in an older person who has a disease surface, but perhaps from birth. Click one more time to the next thing. I like to look at the endocannabinoid system as a target. We'll talk about it that way in just a moment in terms of research, but if you think that from birth through death, there are roles that the endocannabinoid system plays, let's first define what the role of the endocannabinoid system is in one succinct sentence. Press the slide. The endocannabinoid system function is to sustain organisms by modulating physiology. Pretty straightforward. If you remember it just like that, and then apply 5 basic functions that were originally described by DeMarzo back in 1998. He's still probably the most frequently cited endocannabinoid or cannabis researcher. He describes certain functions that, if you think of from birth, start off with, click the slide, George, eating and sleeping. Exactly what a newborn does, exactly what children need to do more of to basically grow up healthy. And that's the key point. So what happens then once you hit your prime, you're mature, remember that happens in your late teens, early 20s, when your body is generally fully developed, perhaps, and this is a very important consideration too, the adolescent brain may not finish forming until the early to mid-20s. That's a bone of contention now because of the effects that are seen with chronic, especially higher level exposure to adolescents, especially when an adolescent's risk-taking is a more likely behavior. So let's click one more time and see 2 more functions. Relaxing and forgetting. Well, these are so far 4 of the 5 original things that DeMarzo popularized as why the endocannabinoid system functions in the first place. Relaxing and forgetting are really part, as we think of it today, more of adult life, isn't it? Most people who use cannabis, not just to sleep, but to chill, to take away the stress. And certainly, as far as forgetting, that's not only a side effect, but an effect. The difference between it being a side effect or desired one from when people use cannabis, that gives the physician's guidance and determination as far as how that may be affecting productivity and lifestyle. But there's a 5th function. And the 5th function, in fact, may be the most important to new novel therapeutic applications. Press one more time. That's protecting. And protecting, if you think about it, is where CB2 receptors, also CB1, but particularly CB2, immune system modulation. The way that the body responds to a chronic disease is that CB2 receptors get revealed, and they show up exactly where you think they would. Someone with Parkinson's, where do you think they're going to show up? In those areas of the brain responsible for dopamine. Bowel things, chronic bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome. It's not just neurologic, it involves the immune system. So CB2 receptors, and perhaps their greatest clinical application yet to be realized, will be involving protecting as the human body ages and responds to chronic diseases. It makes perfect teleologic sense that we would have this system to complement our immune system. Remember, the immune system is there mostly to respond to protein invaders, bacterial, viruses, things like that. The endocannabinoid system, on the other hand, involves in a response to chronic diseases, and that's how they become chronic diseases and don't kill us outright. So I like the way that this configurative model is used to teach the effects of how the endocannabinoid system from birth through death has clinical applications that involve all of these physiologic forms, rather than pigeonholing the endocannabinoid system, say, into neurology, or to cancer therapy, or to anesthesia for pain, for psychiatry, for stress disorders. Let's get out of that mindset, where otherwise it gets usurped and people think that that's all it's about. It's much, much more. Next slide. So then this is the slide I like about the endocannabinoid system's constant orchestrated function. May be difficult to understand. I like the way this appears this way because of the Archer, and the Archer then, as a focused researcher, really does stay focused on the endocannabinoid system being the target. And that's important because this target, as you can tell, is extracted by the apple itself, which I've likened to the plant. once that researcher starts to think or look at the arrow, they're going to shift. That's accurately the target. And this is a concern because sometimes healers are enamored with the plant and get distracted by it because the plant, remember, has only revealed the system that we have, not because of the plant. Next slide. This is kind of a cool picture, and I want to get into showing you why the receptors work differently. Here's a synapse, and I'm going to try to start to get into some of the subtleties in these next slides that show the subtleties of how this receptor system modulates, not an on-off system at all. The on-off system, by the way, we're most taught in medical schools about, you have these encapsulated things on the presynaptic side that release their chemicals in an all or nothing fashion and trigger a reaction to go on the postsynaptic side. That's not the way the endocannabinoid system works. In fact, those chemicals, 2,8-D and anandamide, are made on the postsynaptic surface down below. They migrate retroactively, retro direction, rather to the presynaptic CB1 receptor shown here, that then in turn triggers the release of not just one type of neurotransmitter, but many types depending on the receptor system's function. CB1 receptors and CB2 are very complicated. They sometimes exert differential effects depending on how they're triggered, and obviously some horribly harmful tries at research chemicals have revealed the subtle ways that CB1 receptors can't be constructed to respond to a chemical. Of things that get brought to mind or diet control things, you try to minimize CB1 effects on hunger by blocking it, but at the same time you can block obviously relief of stress, lead to fear, paranoia, and in that case, suicide. So there have been attempts at how to modulate chemically that so far has found it to be remarkably, but very curiously, not just challenging, but complicated in fine-tuning. There are things going on that are very exciting, though, that are in the next coming up. Move to the next slide. This next slide gives you an idea of some of the complexities of that CB receptor. This is showing a schematic graph on how the receptors can be modulated. We're not just talking about on-off. We're talking about positive influence, negative influence, partial, blocking, and it's not that the entire receptor necessarily gets affected, but sometimes only a section of it. Those are called allosteric modulators, and they appear to be very, very exciting for future application. I'll show you one in just a moment that in particular has fine-tuned one function of CB1 receptors. In addition to that, we have something that we would not call allosteric, but we would call, let's say, super modulators. And those supermodulators activate the endocannabinoid systems in ways that we have not evolved to encounter. Those are potentially very harmful. They're very interesting for investigation, but they include things like spice and K2. Those are manufactured compounds that could be considered as super activators, not necessarily agonists or antagonists, but just interacting with the receptors in more than total ways than the body ever designed. Next slide. So anandamide and 2,8-G, which are the two chemicals seen here, are formed and then broken down. Most of the exciting research that's going on today are based on the breakdown, the enzymatic breakdown of these two endogenous chemicals. In particular, the breakdown of anandamide. 2,8-G and anandamide do function somewhat different. 2,8-G has been sort of claimed as the workhorse. It's there, it's doing its thing, it's all or nothing in some of the way it works. But anandamide has much more subtle and partial activation, modulation, and even affecting allosteric responses on some of the receptors that show great promise. So in fact, manipulating levels of anandamide through the FAAH enzyme that breaks it down is where a lot of exciting research not only is being done, this has already been done. This is not theoretical, what I'm sharing with you. This already is happening. It's happening in some human clinical trials with so far pretty impressive successes for safety. But FA modulation right now seems to be an area of great clinical interest. Next slide. These are some examples of allosteric modulators. Some of this is fairly recent. These studies just came out the second half of last year. Pregnenolone, listed on the left, is considered a negative allosteric modulator. The reason I'm showing this to you is it tends to exert effects on THC that mitigate many of the addicting effects of THC, and has been thought of as something that could be used therapeutically for patients who do have addictive problems with it. That's kind of an exciting area of research through its being a negative allosteric modulator. Well, guess what? I'm showing you a slide on the right, and cannabidiol happens to also show negative allosteric modulation. So when you look at old cultivars of cannabis, ones that existed a long time ago, and you see much more representation of cannabidiol, that likely, in my opinion, represents a natural balance that mitigated some of the effects of very high THC varietals. So in fact, it was widely available years ago, but again, because of the Afghani #1 push strains, it's found its way out of most genomes. Advance to the next slide. Obviously, combinations are not only of the cannabinoids, but also involved in terpenes and terpenoid through entourage effects. I will continue with this through the next slide then to speed things up. These are some examples of some of the terpenes that you may or may not be familiar with. But again, myrcene may be the one that is most responsible for hypnotic effects compared to many of these others here. The reason I like to show these slides coming up is we're able now to actually show terpene content and hopefully use that along with the combinations of phytocannabinoids to exert different effects so that something becomes relatively, of course, more stimulating over and above combinations of simply the phytocannabinoids. Next slide. When we talked about combinations of chemicals that I just shared with you a moment ago, this was said better by Chopra than I could. And it's revealing one of the problems I said appears with Marinol before. You never find a traditional Chinese medicine doctor or anyone from Eastern medicine to think that they would prescribe a patient one drug. It's always combinations of things, and as I said, even the FDA now is much more likely to look at combinations of mixtures as they exist in cannabis today and otherwise in former combinations of chemicals. Next slide. In seeking out then, where's the sweet spot? If everybody's familiar with Sativex, GW Pharmaceuticals, Sativex, that is the only drug currently in the FDA pipeline. Sativex has approximately equal parts of both THC and CBD. So if you look way to the right, those are most of today's common varietals THC. It has side effects, and nearly all THC with next to no CBD. But of course, Project CBD in a more attuned audience now to perhaps its medicinal values and combining effects with THC reveals that way off to the left, what CBD by itself generally regarded as hemp. But where the sweet spot may lie are in landrace populations that probably today exist maybe in places like the Neck Valley, Lebanon, where you have to go there to find some of these older varietals. So in fact, the whole plant evolved these two principal phytocannabinoids that are now being reintroduced as a combined balance pepper. Next slide. Sativex, as we said, is the combination of balanced chemicals, and I said balance was key to this whole talk. Next slide. When you have balance, you have therapeutic outcome, and I wanted to show this slide compiled in 2013 because it looked at the effects of comprehensive treatment of chronic pain. And it looked at different preparations of cannabinoids, from synthetics to plant-derived ones, to see if they're effective in alleviating pain from double-blind controlled studies. Those in green showed therapeutic merit. Those in white or gray did not. If you looked, and I know the writing is small, so I'll just cipher it for you, those dust essence of white or gray failed result studies to alleviate pain, none of them represent combinations of chemicals. And that's why I'm sharing with you that straight THC by itself in cultivars that may be out there available therapeutically or in recreation are not likely to yield the beneficial effects for the single most commonly authorized diagnosis of pain. Next slide. Getting into the terpenes then, there are a lot of varietals on the left that are listed, and generally they fall into certain terpene families or what are called superclasses. This is the way that some of the terpenes now are being categorized to hopefully derive therapeutic merit along with the principal phytocannabinoid. The next slide breaks it down a little differently, and I realized that the diagrams are pretty small because there are actually 3 separate analyses of different cultivars. To the left is classic cookies, then classic OG in the middle with classic train wreck on the right. The thing I wanted to point out to you was not necessarily where that black sort of field that looks like maybe a record is those reveal generally the phytocannabinoids. I want to talk with you more about the colored section in the middle and the bottom. Those are diagrams, especially the pie charts that are colored in the middle, of the effects of terpenes. And as you can see, depending on the constituents of the terpenes that are color coordinated and the site below, they tend to be either sedating or stimulating. In this case, they call it energy. Little red triangle that you see in the middle there, being low energy versus high energy, can be correlated more so with terpene function and presence than it can with the phytocannabinoids themselves. This is important because many people are mislabeling, as you're well aware, the hybrids today as being either indica or sativa. Everything's a hybrid, folks, I promise you there. And that sativa versus indica will be a controversy of the past thanks to genetic analyses. You might be interested to know that I'm the only non-Jamaican in my family. My wife is Jamaican, my kids are half-blood. And I can tell you that lamb's bread from Jamaica that's classically been regarded as being a sativa of sativas. And you'll find that on Leafy's website. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I'll tell you that John Page in Calgary at Bonandia last year deciphered what lamb's bread truly is. And it finds out that it is not a sativa. Doesn't mean it's not therapeutic the way it's used for the people who were there using it, but it does not represent the genetic lineage of some of those older plants that were like sativas. So I want to conclude now with genetics. Next slide. You should see a genetics chart there of different alleles that are under investigation. And most of them are deciphered like this to yield particular cannabinoids. This is a very exciting career track if anybody plans on going into things, because the Human Genome Project around the turn of the century, the millennia, ushered in an entirely new realm of science that is a paradigm shift from the way I was taught and is the future. Within 2 years after the first, after the Human Genome Project, you had the first plant genome. By 2011, the first cannabis genome was done by John up in Anandia. To the tune of 7 figures and many months of teasing out the proper genome. Well, there's good news. Advance to the next slide a minute. This is now a chart from this past year, even this year actually, current, showing the different varietals of cannabis that have been tested, and there's well over 100 there. Some of them are drug types, some of them hemp types, but if you can see, in the top right especially, there's certain clusters, certain areas that are common to many varietals that all seem to go back and have a common link. This configuration of how it's shown I find to be fascinating, because if we advance to the next slide, now we'll start to look at only the medical cannabis genomics and a search of over 100 different varietals for common lineage. The reason I'm fascinated with this is because this speaks back to not what was around when I was in high school, but what about 100 years ago that may have existed in the Caribbean? Or how about 500 years ago in Africa that came over here with slave trade, already having been that continent for thousands of years, let alone Asia. There you'll have probably matching revealed with genetics that evolved in different cultures, of different genetic predispositions of varietals that were popular because they evolved over thousands of years, not only over the last 20 or so. So I see great promise in genetics relating to sort of a teasing out of searches I've listed here, maybe for an ancestral holy grail formulary in contrast to without now. So the next slide really is just a starting slide. I know we took a little longer getting started. I apologize if you're sleeping. It's fine. I understand. I can't see you. You can see me. And if anybody still is of interest, want to chat about anything, it's been an honor to speak with you tonight, carry it with you from A to Z. But the Z is really G. Genetics is where it's going. I want to conclude with that.
Doctor, we're going to have a couple of questions for you now.
First of all, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Our first question is from Max. You have to come talk into the computer because you're really bad.
Not a problem.
Hi, Max.
Hey, thanks so much for your presentation today. I really appreciate it. I would love to talk with you about a million different things, but I'm going to not because of all the other people who probably want to ask a few questions themselves. To me, there's a gigantic elephant in the room that I can't wrap my mind around, which is this idea that, you're talking a lot about Robert Clark's work, who's a dear friend of mine, and the guy who collected that genomic research, Dr. Lynch, I actually helped him collect some of the cannabis DNA in tissue that's doing some of the genomics that we're looking at. And so one thing that you mentioned was your federal prohibition versus bioethics, which I really appreciated, and I thought would actually work great for psilocybin, ayahuasca, peyote, and MDMA. But when it comes to cannabis, my question is, if this is about what's federally prohibited and why clinicians are afraid of recommending cannabis due to the federal license, based on the federal law, which is the term marijuana means all parts of the plant, Cannabis sativa L. The only term and the only plant that's federally illegal is Cannabis sativa L. And we have so much genomic research that is pointing to the fact that NLH, narrow leaf hemp type, is more genomically hemp, which is by DNA and law definition, inert of THC. It's actually quite possible that genomically there are no sativa cultivars in the dispensaries, and that everything is a combination of either indica, afghanica. And so why hasn't this been addressed at the federal level? Why can't we say, I'm not prescribing, medical cannabis sativa, I'm prescribing medical cannabis indica, which has been, known by our government to be the medicine of the United States before Prohibition. Why aren't we talking about that there's only one type of plant that's federally illegal, and it's the type that isn't as medically beneficial as what we all use on a daily basis?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, you're very much attuned to the genomics here. To begin with, the genetics in itself is a fairly new endeavor. Just because John Page in 2011 did those first genomes, and they, like I said, took months and 7 figures, by the end of last year, the reason this is exciting and ramping up, by the end of last year, you had this done in half a day, and the price just got under $1,000. And what's more is they can do it with a hole punch sized piece of leaf. So the fact is, the more data that goes in, as far as that, for the genetics purpose, yes, I said before, the government is looking for data. Well, data, and I'm going to give one little comment that they said in terms of the NIH talk this past March. The plural of anecdotal is not data. So they're very rigid that way. As far as elucidating sativa versus indica and passing a definition within a given law's definition, I need to share with you that I do try to avoid the slippery slope of commenting on existing law versus evidence. The evidence that the government is looking for is not the definition of what cannabis is. They're looking for the evidence of what cannabis does. And so, in essence, the reason I brought up the slides about the genetics is that I think there's a bright future to bring back a different safety profile, getting to the question of what cannabis does rather than what it is. And as far as understanding what it does, though, most of the exciting research, most of the work that pharmaceutical companies are dealing with today, with the notable exception of GW Pharmaceuticals, has to deal not with the plant, but with the receptor system and modulating it in other ways. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and along with the discoveries of the genetics will coincide the discoveries of how this receptor system can be modulated in subtle ways by manipulating the enzymes that feed into its production of natural cannabinoids and out of it for enzymatic breakdown. So I don't think I've succinctly answered your question, but for the most part, it's a parallel track to helping end what I think is wrong, prohibition. I notably do not take advocacy positions for or against it politically, because then I become ostracized from one side or the other, and that impedes a constructive dialogue. But make no doubt about it, I am fully on board to say that it no longer represents the criteria of what a Schedule II substance, Schedule I substance is defined as, and I prefer to stick with that definition as a general rule rather than getting into the specifics of indica versus sativa. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks.
Block. Any more questions? No? Well, let's give him a round of applause.